Grant Whitlock lit a fire to clear 4 acres of dead brush. He never expected a fire to uncover a staircase that led to a locked door in the middle of his own farm, a door that had been sealed shut on purpose, decades before he was born. He almost didn't notice it. If the wind had shifted an hour earlier, if the burn had stopped a few feet short, that hillside would still be sitting there today, keeping whatever's behind that wall a secret forever. But it didn't, and what he found next would take him 2 weeks, a dead relative's old receipts, and one very confused 90-year-old neighbor to figure out. Let's back up. Grant had come home to Mountain Grove, Missouri 3 years earlier, taking over the family farm after his dad's health made a decision for him. 120 acres, mostly good ground, except for 4 acres behind the old dairy barn that hadn't grown anything but cedar and briar since before Grant's father was even born. It wasn't a lot of land, but it was land he paid taxes on every single year for absolutely nothing. So on a calm Saturday morning, wind steady out of the northwest, Grant did what farmers in the Ozarks have done for generations. He burned it. The fire ran hot through the afternoon, cedar cracking and popping, black smoke curling into a sky that was slowly turning orange. By nightfall, the hillside was scorched flat. Grant figured that was that. A few acres of ash he'd need to rake through before the ground was worth anything. He was wrong. Sunday morning, walking the burn to check for hot spots, his rake caught on something that had no business being there. He knelt down, pushed the ash aside with his glove. A slab of gray stone, cut square, set at an angle no natural rock formation sits at. He cleared more ash, 6 inches back, and a little lower down the hill. Another one, identical, then a third. That's when his neighbor, Kurt Hobbs, pulled up in his truck to see how the burn had gone, and found Grant on his knees in the char, not even looking up. "Those aren't rocks," Kurt said. "No," Grant said quietly. "They're not." Neither man said another word for a long moment. They just stood there, staring down the slope, watching the steps disappear into brush that hadn't burned yet, vanishing into a hillside that had kept us buried longer than either one of them had been alive. And that's just the beginning. If you're the kind of person who can't walk away from a mystery, especially one that's been sitting in the ground for 60 years, waiting for somebody to find it, you're exactly who this channel is for. Hit subscribe, because what Grant found at the bottom of those steps is even stranger than what's up top. For the next 6 days, Grant refused to touch the hillside with anything heavier than a hand trowel. No shovel, no machine. Kurt thought he was being paranoid, worried about caving something in, but Grant would later admit it wasn't really about caution. It felt wrong to rush it, like whoever built those steps deserved better than a man in a hurry. 11 steps uncovered by the end of day 1, 19 by day 2. Day 3, his trowel caught on metal. Buried in a carved notch on one of the upper risers was a rusted iron bracket, the base of a handrail, mortared straight into solid stone. Not a rope, not a wooden post jammed into dirt. A permanent, engineered handrail, built into rock that had taken real skill to cut. You don't install something like that for a path you walk once in a while. You build that for people hauling something heavy, in bad weather, in the dark, people who needed to come back to this exact spot. Over and over for years, Grant kept digging. 23 steps total, dropping nearly 9 feet below the level of the old barn lot. Every step the same width. Every drop between them nearly identical, riser to riser. This wasn't some farmhand's weekend project. This was designed. And at the bottom, no door, no opening, just a wall. Tight-fitted stone, mortared shut, flat and blank, like it was never meant to be found again. Kurt took one look and figured it was an old root cellar, capped off and forgotten. Made sense. Grant figured he was probably right. He sat down on the bottom step to catch his breath, his back against the cold stone, and that's when he noticed something strange. His left boot felt colder than his right. He pulled a match from his jacket, struck it, and held the flame an inch from the seam in the mortar. The flame bent, not from wind. There wasn't any down in that cut. It bent toward the wall, like something behind it was pulling the air in. He tried it again, then again. Same result, every time. He pressed his palm flat against the stone. It wasn't the normal cool of shaded rock on a fall afternoon. It was cold, The specific kind of cold that only shows up when there's real temperature difference between two sides of something solid. He grabbed a thermometer from the truck and held it against the wall for 2 full minutes. 61 degrees. He climbed back up the steps and checked the open air behind him. 89. Whatever was sealed behind that wall, it wasn't a root cellar, and it definitely wasn't empty. Grant didn't touch that wall for 2 more days. Instead, he went looking for what was feeding it. He drove into town and bought a length of thin steel rod, then spent the better part of the morning working it into mortar seams along the coldest section of the wall. He wasn't trying to break through. He wanted to know what he was dealing with before he did anything he couldn't undo. The rod slid through the mortar joint after about 4 inches and hit open space. He walked it sideways, inch by inch, mapping the edge of whatever was back there. 6 feet of probing later, he found the far side. Open space, at least 18 inches wide at the narrowest point he could find. Whatever was behind that wall wasn't a crawl space. It wasn't a collapsed cellar full of rubble. It was a room. 2 days after that, Grant went looking uphill for the source of that cold draft, and it didn't take long to find it. About 70 feet up the slope, half swallowed by cedar roots, he found a length of clay pipe sticking out of the ground at a slight angle, 4 inches across, and cold air was moving through it steady enough to feel against the back of his hand. 20 feet further up, aligned with the first, he found a second pipe. Same thing, same steady draft. Somebody had built a ventilation system into this hillside. Intake up top, outflow down at the wall. Simple. No electricity, no moving parts, just a natural pull of warm air rising and cold air sinking, engineered right into the land. Grant caught a man named Ross Delaney, 72 years old, who'd spent 40 years doing stonework across 3 counties before he retired. Ross spent 20 minutes running his hands over the mortar joints on that wall, tapping here and there, before he gave his opinion. The middle section, about 6 feet wide, 4 feet tall, had been built at a different time than the stone around it. Different mortar mix. Coursing didn't match. Somebody had opened this wall once, then sealed it back up deliberately, probably after some kind of collapse or structural scare. The stone around the patch was in better shape than the patch itself. Ross figured they could pull it out safely if they took their time. They did it in an afternoon, working the stones loose one at a time and setting each one aside instead of breaking it. What opened up wasn't a cellar. It was a corridor, 5 feet wide, better than 6 feet tall. Stone on both sides, running back into total darkness. The floor sloped gently downhill, with a shallow channel cut along the right edge that fed toward a drain at the far end. Grant stepped in with a flashlight. The corridor ran close to 60 feet before it opened into a much larger chamber. Stone shelves lined 3 of the walls, each one about 8 feet long, set at staggered heights, with the rotted remains of wooden dividers still wedged between some of them. Iron hooks, rusted solid, were driven into the stone at intervals overhead. Broken pottery littered the floor. In one corner, what was left of wooden crates had collapsed into a soft pile of splinters. The thermometer read 59 degrees. Outside it was 93, and carved into the stone facing of 5 separate shelf sections, someone had cut a single letter into each one with a chisel. Grant read them slowly, moving down the row. WHCTD. He couldn't make them fit anything. Categories of food, maybe? Some kind of code. He drove to the county courthouse the following Friday and pulled the old plat records for his section of Howell County. The 1933 map listed 5 adjoining farms by family name: Whitlock, Hobbs, Combs, Truitt, Delaney, not categories. Families, 5 neighboring farms, each one carved into stone of their own personal section of shelving. The County Historical Society had almost nothing on it, just a single mention buried in a 1934 Agricultural Extension Bulletin referencing something called the Bell Hollow Store Cooperative in one throwaway sentence about community food preservation efforts. No description, no photos. But Grant found something better a few weeks later, going through a box of his grandfather Wendell's old farm papers, a receipt dated 1954, tucked into a folder of maintenance records. Stone and lime, Bell Hollow entrance. Total, $9.60. Signed at the bottom, Wendell Whitlock. His own grandfather had helped seal the entrance shut. Grant tracked down a woman named Opal Truitt, 86 years old, who'd grown up on the farm next to his. She remembered the room, called it the cold room, said her mother used to send her up there every September with a basket after the apple harvest came in, and that the place had a smell she hadn't thought about in 50 years, mineral and cold, faintly sweet. She said it stopped being used sometime around 1954. When she was about 11, she'd always assumed the roof caved in. An old farmer named Dale Combs, 74, still working part of his grandfather's original land, recognized a letter on one of the shelves the second Grant showed him a photo. Said his grandfather had branded the same initial into every tool he ever owned. Grant managed to track down descendants from 4 of the 5 families. Not everyone could be found. Not everyone wanted to come. But on a Saturday that October, 4 people stood in that corridor with flashlights, looking at letters their grandparents had carved into stone almost 90 years earlier. The woman from the Truitt family stood in front of that single letter for a long time and didn't say a word. A county structural engineer came out that November and cleared the main chamber as stable. A back section of the corridor, another 30 feet past the main room, had a weak spot in the ceiling and stayed off limits until it could be shored up properly. Rough estimate for stabilizing the rest. Somewhere between $1,500 and $3,000, depending on materials. Grant didn't turn it into a tourist stop, didn't file for any historic designation. He just fixed what needed fixing, reframed the entrance, cleared the drainage channel, replaced the rotted shelf dividers with treated lumber, and cleared the roots choking the old ventilation pipes. That August, he set a thermometer inside, 94 outside, 58 inside, a 36-degree swing, with no electricity, no refrigeration, nothing but the shape of the hillside, and the good sense of 5 families who understood exactly what they were doing back in 1933. He stored that fall's potato crop down there. 3 varieties of apples, too. The potatoes were still firm in January. The apples outlasted anything he'd ever managed in the barn. Before he'd worked most of it out himself, Grant had asked an old neighbor, Lawrence Combs, if he remembered anything about Bell Hollow. Lawrence said he recalled the name from his father, but he'd always figured it was just a spring or maybe an old well. Then he said something Grant wrote down and read back to himself more than once. Your generation goes looking for history. Mine was just glad we didn't need it anymore. Grant's grandfather hadn't sealed that entrance to hide anything. He'd sealed it because part of the ceiling had come down, and by 1954, the reasons to keep using it were mostly gone anyway. Electric refrigeration had reached the county. The roads had gotten better. Cold storage was a phone call away. 5 families who pooled their labor in 1933 because they genuinely needed had simply moved on to something easier, and nobody made a decision to forget the place. It just stopped being necessary, and the brush did the rest. The steps are clean now. Grant never polished them, never tried to make them look restored. They look exactly like what they are. Stone cut into an Ozark hillside in 1933 by 5 families who needed somewhere to keep their food alive through the winter. He stood at the top of them one morning in late October and looked down at the entrance he'd rebuilt with his own hands. If you didn't know the steps were there, you'd never know the steps were there. The hillside just looks like a hillside. He hadn't been looking for any of this. He'd been looking for 4 acres of pasture ground. The fire gave him that. And underneath the ash, it gave him something that had been waiting in that hillside since before he was born, waiting for someone to clear away whatever had grown over it. The stone never moved. The letters never moved. Only the people who remembered where the steps went had gone. If a story like this one, something ordinary that cracks open into something nobody alive remembers, is exactly your kind of thing, subscribe, because we got dozens more like it waiting to be told. And if you've ever cleared land on your own property and found something your family had no idea was there, tell us about it in the comments. We read every one.